All right, everybody say hello to Mohammed. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So thanks for having us here. We're really happy to sponsor the event. I've spent an unreasonable amount of my life inside OpenStack, and I still continue to do so. So it's great to see a lot of familiar faces, but I also get excited when I go to these events and I see a lot of unfamiliar faces, which is really exciting. It means we've got a lot of people coming in. And today I just wanted to briefly talk a little bit about our story in OpenStack and a little bit about what we do. Definitely not going to make this a giant sales pitch, but it's a little bit about talking about our story in open source, and hopefully, that's going to be a bit inspiring for some of the other organizations that are trying to adopt something similar to that. So I'm going to talk about our personal evolution inside OpenStack, some of the milestones that we hit across the time, with the rise of Kubernetes and everybody wanting to run Kubernetes everywhere, how we kind of got more involved in that. Then people wanted, stuff like Keycloak and then a lot of interest around Rust. So I'll get right to the slides. So the early days of OpenStack, we actually deployed our public cloud that runs to this day using just manual installation of packages. That was like the only way. There wasn't a lot of open source projects with automation. There wasn't a lot of things happening around that. And so the install guide lives until today. People still use it to deploy OpenStack. They probably shouldn't, but it's a really good way to learn how OpenStack works. I really consider our install guides in OpenStack to be equivalent to the set of documents, which is like Kubernetes the hard way, right? That's pretty much the equivalent of it. And so obviously, we had the challenge of the first ever deployment back then. I think we were, running the bear release of OpenStack, which I had learned that even though it's spelled BEXAR, it's pronounced bear. So I got to learn that because I think it's an area in Texas somewhere, and that's where it came from. And essentially, that's kind of where we started. Our cloud to this day is still running in Montreal, the same exact region, been upgraded over and over. And I always thought it cool that we still have a VM running from 2015 until today that's still running there and humming along in that environment. And so then we figured like, hey, this doesn't scale. We got to find a way to make this better. And so at the time we started looking at the options, and Puppet was the hotness back then. Everybody was using Puppet to automate everything. It was really Puppet or Chef, and Puppet was what we went with. And so Puppet OpenStack was a project that existed, which was a set of Puppet modules that allowed you to deploy OpenStack. We use those very heavily. And they worked really well. I ended up being the PTL of that project for a cycle or two. I don't remember, but it was working really nicely. But the thing that we started running into is Puppet was great at managing single nodes. It's not very good at coordinating across a fleet of machines. So for example, you imagine trying to deploy a database cluster for your OpenStack cloud across 3 nodes. You're going to have the jankiest setup ever, and you're probably not going to be very confident in having it actually run. And so we figured, hey, what do we do? How do we, do this better? And then we discovered OpenStack Ansible, which I see a lot of people here probably are familiar with, probably people have worked with. And we, Ansible, what was nice about it is instead with this way, we actually could do and run operations across a fleet of systems and have them coordinated, going from one system to another. And it was great and it worked really well. I became the project team lead for the project for quite a few cycles. So I was very, familiar with it. But, one of the issues that we kept having was that as we scaled up things, it really started to struggle. Like running playbooks across large fleets would take hours, and we just thought that like, hey, there's probably a better way to do that. Things like health checks and the ability to do rollback and all that didn't really. So then what we did is this was back in Kubernetes 1.18. So I think this is 4 years ago or so. We figured, hey, you know what? We're going to start looking into OpenStack Helm. At the time, it was massively maintained by AT&T, and there was a couple of other organizations that were using it. And then what we did essentially is we used Terraform to actually, stamp out all the Helm charts into the Kubernetes cluster. It worked really nice. We even had things like, generating passwords automatically, and then taking those and feeding them into the Terraform, and it was really nice. And we also started integrating OVN into the equation, when OVN has really made a huge leap in networking for OpenStack and improved the stability. If you can understand it. If you don't, then probably didn't for you. And then our issue was we've got a lot of people and a lot of our customers that want on-premise clouds. And it turns out one of the hardest things about running Terraform is you have to manage the state. And the state really is like, if you lose it, you're really, really at a tough spot. And so telling people on premise, like, hey, try and figure out where to get your state stored. Nobody's going to store their state on Terraform Cloud. That seems kind of a little reckless. And so there's a lot of kind of issues with it. And we figured like, this is just not going to scale. Also back then, the HashiCorp licensing stuff wasn't a thing, and now is a thing. So, we don't know how to deal with that. And so, what we did is we refactored everything to instead drive Helm using Ansible. So all we do is we use Ansible to stamp all these Helm charts into these Kubernetes clusters. We've got playbooks that deploy Ceph, then playbooks that deploy Kubernetes, and integrate that with the Ceph cluster. And then it deploys all the OpenStack components. And then we said, how can we make this better? So now that we have our Kubernetes, there's a whole ecosystem of existing open source projects that we can take advantage of. So we added things like Kubernetes Stack to get full visibility into your environment. We added things like Vector and Loki so we can get automatic logging for all of the pods in the environment, as well as all your journals for all the systems. So immediately you get full logging for everything. And obviously, we take advantage of all the operators. So, for example, instead of before relying on our code to build a Galera cluster, now we can install an operator that is designed by people who do this for a living, and they focus on doing that. And we can focus on running clouds instead of focusing on figuring out how to get Galera or Rabbit or all that other stuff to run. So that's kind of the whole advantage of taking advantage of, not necessarily taking advantage, but leveraging other open source ecosystems so we can strengthen something to all take advantage of. And then the other thing is, well, we found that with OpenStack, the single sign-on story is a little tough. The single sign-on story is very complicated. It relies on a whole bunch of other components. And then so what we did instead is we natively integrated Keycloak. And so by natively integrating Keycloak, you can use whatever backend with Keycloak that works. And so by that way, you can use LDAP, you can use OpenID Connect, SAML, and then we have our Keystone Web SSO to actually take care of all of that for you, so that you get that native cloud ability of actually being able to, simply do a CLI login, and you'll actually have a browser window pop up, do the authentication, and get through it. So as usual, I have too many slides for how much I'm going through. So I'm going to jump to one key one, and I'll hand it over to our next sponsors. But very quickly, we've got a cluster API driver that we built for Magnum that lets you take advantage of the cluster API provider for OpenStack, and we integrated, work very hard with the community to make it available. We've got Migrate Kit, which there's a lot of talks about. There will be talks about that today. And it's a tool that allows you, an open source tool entirely, that lets you migrate from VMware to OpenStack with almost just 30 seconds of downtime for the VM in total, regardless of the size of the VM. And it leverages a lot of other open source projects. We've done some advanced schedulers. So we've actually got a failure domain scheduler that we built for OpenStack Nova, which allows you, if you've got multiple racks, you've got some sort of policy that you've got to be across racks. We've built that as well. And I'm happy to go and talk, if you catch me, just ask me about any of these slides, and I'm happy to talk to you about, or in our booth. I'll skip those through quickly, and I just leave you with that slide so I can keep us on time. Thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate it, and enjoy your time here.